From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. U.S. and Israeli officials convene virtually to discuss Israel's plans for Rafah after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledges to carry out an attack once civilians have been moved from the city. We'll have more with former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Executive Director of the McCain Institute, Evelyn Farkas. Traders price in lower odds of a Fed rate cut in June after strong ISM manufacturing data today and last week's PCE read, with the latest jobs report due Friday. Labor economist Betsey Stevenson joins this hour. And Donald Trump set to visit two swing states tomorrow, Michigan and Wisconsin, as financial disclosures show his Truth Social lost $58 million last year. Our political panel will weigh in. But we begin this evening at the White House, where officials from Israel and the U.S. held talks virtually today. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre discussed the conversation with reporters earlier.
We wanted to move very quickly on this, and today the meeting is happening virtually because we understand, and obviously you all understand, how important it is to have this conversation. We've been very clear about our concerns about a military operation into Rafah. We know that there are more than 1 million Palestinians who are in Rafah right now. I'll say one more thing. When Jake Sullivan was here at the podium not too long ago, he believed and he said there are alternative ways of doing this, alternative ways of going after Hamas.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Mario Parker, who leads our White House and politics coverage. And Mario, we just had the joint statement, the readout from this drop. We know that it was Jake Sullivan together with Secretary of State Antony Blinken on this call with their counterparts. They said it lasted about 2 hours. They agreed. They share the objective to see Hamas defeated in Rafah. The U.S. side, though, expressed its concerns with various courses of action. I guess the question going forward is to what degree will those concerns be heard by the Israelis?
Well, it looks like as of right now, it looks like those concerns will be heard. If you take a little bit if you look a little bit of tea leaf reading, if you will, with the fact that they're going to meet in person next time. The tensions, of course, flared up last week when Netanyahu called the delegation back after the U.S. abstained from the UN Security Council vote on the ceasefire. So the fact that they're going to at least, the U.S. said that it expressed its concerns, but the fact that they're going to at least meet in person seems to suggest that there's some type of traction there, at least.
Well, to your point about how the initial in-person meeting was delayed because the U.S. abstained rather than vetoed a resolution calling for a ceasefire, just kind of speaks to the change in tone and the public change in tone we've gotten from the Biden administration in some of its language toward the Israelis and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu specifically. And I suppose we don't have a reason to believe that will change.
No, not at all. If you want to look for a reason that it will change, just look no further than every event that Biden has had, every public event. The last one last week where he appeared with Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and it was interrupted by protesters. Mm-hmm. Almost every stop on the campaign trail for Biden, he's getting some type of pressure here. And this is international pressure as well. One thing I want to add is also you're starting to see some of this kind of seep over into the Republican Party. You have former President Donald Trump speaking to Israeli journalists who said that this thing needs to end as well.
I'm glad you brought up protesters because obviously President Biden has faced them domestically, but there were tens of thousands of protesters out in Israel over the weekend as well, calling for new elections. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that would be disruptive, which of course is happening during a time of war. But he also had this to say on ceasefire negotiations and hostages. Take a listen to his televised address.
Anyone who says I'm not doing everything I can to bring back the hostages is wrong and is misleading. And whoever knows the truth and is still repeating this lie is causing unnecessary grief to the family of the hostages. The truth is that while Israel has flexed its positions in the negotiations, Hamas hardens its positions.
So obviously these negotiations, Mario, are still ongoing. Do we have an understanding from the U.S. side as to just how much progress is being made? Because obviously the U.S., Hamas and Israel, just some of the parties at the table. There's the Qataris and Egyptians as well.
No, it's still unclear at this point. The fact that folks are still at the table, I guess, is a great sign, but it's still really unclear. And again, you just played the clip of Benjamin Netanyahu. The way that Biden administration or Democrats even writ large, you had Jim Clyburn saying that this is more of a Netanyahu thing. This isn't sentiment toward Israel. This is more of a Netanyahu's about his handling of this conflict. I think that's what you're saying there.
It was also interesting over the weekend to hear from a Democratic Senator, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, saying that Netanyahu has been giving the finger, and that's a quote, to President Biden. Mario Parker, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, elsewhere, House Speaker Mike Johnson says he expects to put a supplemental funding package to vote after the recess, and Ukraine would be included in that. He spoke last night on Fox News.
When it comes to the supplemental, we've been working to build that consensus. We've been talking to all the members, especially now over the district work period. When we return after this work period, we'll be moving a product, but it's going to, I think, have some important innovations.
Joining us now for more on those important innovations is Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government. So, Kate, when he's talking about innovations here, we're talking things like this being a loan rather than just outright aid, or potentially using seized frozen Russian assets to pay for Ukraine's war effort. Will these ideas actually be enough to get this over the finish line?
Well, already today you've had people sort of poking holes in some of these ideas that, oh, well, there's not enough money in the frozen, Russian assets, or that's just not going to work, or what have you. But he's definitely trying to message this in a way that, he's trying to show his, kind of detractors on the right. Who have, said that we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's, put forth this motion to vacate, kind of putting a threat over his job potentially. So he's trying to maybe message to them that he is not just willing to put the Senate passed bill on the House floor. He wants to put his stamp on it. He wants to put a little, some trade-offs in there. But it's not a smooth path.
Well, whether or not it's trade-offs that he puts in there or the Senate package, either way, it does seem, to your point, that anything related to Ukraine aid going to the floor of the House for a vote is what would trigger Marjorie Taylor Greene actually acting on that motion to vacate. At least that's what she has suggested. Is Mike Johnson just seeming willing to call her bluff on this, or does he think Democrats are going to get him out of this mess?
Well, I mean, we know there are some behind-the-scenes discussions happening with Democrats. We don't know necessarily to what extent and how much Democrats would try to protect his job. But certainly Democrats will be there to vote for Ukraine aid unless it were radically different. I mean, that was an extremely strong bipartisan vote out of the Senate. And you have a lot of House Democrats that are, beyond ready. They're past ready to vote for that measure. But yeah, you sort of get the sense, is this him saying, kind of bring it on in a sense, like, are we going to go through a whole other round of no speaker, or, he's also been really making the point that his party has this historically low majority. He's got nothing to work with almost. He reminded everyone in that Fox News interview that, the Senate is controlled by Democrats. There's a Democrat in the White House. And, he is right now this week fundraising, trying to raise money for House Republicans, and says, he wants to expand the majority, and that's the ticket to, getting some of the policies that he wants, that Marjorie Taylor Greene wants, the things that they agree on. I don't know if that kind of messaging is enough to keep his, fellow Republicans in line, but that's what he's been trying.
All right, Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, another story that we're tracking today, Nippon Steel making what it calls a formal commitment on spending and jobs to the United Steelworkers Union. This as the Japanese firm is looking to build support for its $14 billion acquisition of U.S. Steel. The document putting in writing earlier pledges made in a meeting between Nippon Steel's leadership and the union, which have so far failed to sway the labor group, or the president of the United States for that matter, who has also come out against that deal. Now coming up, we'll turn to Fed Chair Jay Powell, who on Friday said they're in no rush to cut rates.
Is strong right now. The labor market is strong right now, and inflation has been coming down. We can and we will be careful about this decision because we can be.
We'll hear from University of Michigan labor economist Betsey Stevenson next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The economy is strong. We see very strong growth. We had growth for last year over 3%. Many forecasters see growth coming down to around 2% this year. That's about roughly what the first quarter looks like. That means that we don't need to be in a hurry to cut. It means we can wait and become more confident that, in fact, inflation is coming down to 2% on a sustainable basis.
That was Fed Chair Jerome Powell on Friday in San Francisco. For more, let's bring in Betsey Stevenson, professor of economics at the University of Michigan and former chief economist at the Department of Labor. Betsey, always good to see you. As we heard the Fed chair there talking about strong growth, we potentially saw more evidence of that in today's economic data. We got ISM manufacturing back in expansion territory, so above a 50 reading for the first time since September of 2022. And it's also worth noting in that data, prices paid was higher. It still seems to be an economy that's hotter, more so than it is cooler. Where is the evidence that a rate cut would be necessary anytime soon?
Well, let's start with the manufacturing, because President Biden has really put a big push on trying to reinvigorate American manufacturing and the auto industry, making sure that, as the global economy recovers from the pandemic and shifts happen in terms of what jobs are where and who's doing what, that U.S. manufacturing workers don't get left behind. And you see that in that kind of data that shows expansion in manufacturing. From the Fed's perspective, I will tell you, I'm going to say the same thing I've been saying for several months now, that it's going to be a longer, more painful wait for the Fed to cut rates than many market participants are hoping for. And the reason is the asymmetry of the risks that they face. If they cut rates too soon and they can't get inflation down a little bit more because they're really still trying to hit that 2% target, they could be faced with a decision to increase rates again. And nobody wants to do that. So they're going to be slower before they cut so that they know once they cut that that's a cut they wanted to make. They can always hurry up and cut rates. They can always cut rates more steeply than, if it looks like they waited too long, right? What's the reaction? If they wait too long, then they cut rates sharper and more quickly. If they cut rates too soon, then they face the risk of potentially having to increase rates, and no one wants to do that. That's what I mean when I say that the risks are a little imbalanced. They have an easier path for correction if they wait too long than if they don't wait long enough.
Yeah, your point is taken on the kind of asymmetric risks here. So if the idea is that they might wait too long, or potentially they would rather wait too long than move too early, in theory, that would be because cracks are starting to show up more materially, specifically in the labor market, which you focus on. Are you seeing any early indications, Betsey, of that happening? Do you fear they may, in fact, wait too long, or is this labor market just too strong to actually still be feeling the effects of what's ongoing tightening?
I really think this is the tough part of the Fed's job, because the labor market is slowing. It has to slow. It couldn't continue to grow at the rate it was growing in 2021 and 2022 unless we open the borders and allow more immigrants in. There simply aren't enough American workers to take jobs at the kind of growth rate that we have seen. And we've all been predicting a slowdown in the labor market for over a year now. And we have seen immigration growth that has allowed us to maintain a really rapid pace of job growth. But we do see some signs of slowing. We don't know that it's slowing too much. We need it to slow to something that's stable. And so I think that's why it's going to be so hard to gauge this. They're seeing signs of slowing. I'm seeing signs of slowing. but I'm not seeing signs of slowing so much that it would warrant them cutting rates before the job of bringing inflation down is done. And that's really the sticky point here, because there's a lot of people, even the people who said the Fed wasn't raising rates quickly enough when we saw signs of inflation, are saying, you know, boy, real rates are quite high right now, given how far inflation has come down. Maybe they should go ahead and cut. But I think the Fed's worry is this last sort of little tiny bit of the journey to get inflation down is going to be the toughest. And so you really do want to wait unless you see signs that we're getting into trouble. And I'll definitely say right now, I see no signs that we're getting into any kind of trouble.
All right, Betsey, I want to return to something you just mentioned there, which is how immigration factors into what we're seeing in the labor market and, frankly, the economy overall, because we talk a lot here on Balance of Power about the politics surrounding the border in migration. Certainly, this is one of the hottest issues, at least in this election cycle. How should we be thinking about the economics, though, of the migration we are seeing? What impact does the flow of migrants over the U.S. southern border have ultimately on the U.S. economy? Is it a net positive or a net negative?
Well, first of all, I want to distinguish between something you just said. You started talking about immigration in general.
Versus migration, point taken.
Like, let's talk about the southern border. And I just want you to know that it's, even if we're only talking about people who enter the United States without the correct documentations or undocumented immigrants, most of them don't come across the southern border. Most of them are people who overstay their visa. So, you know, that is a problem. And I know it's one that, you know, creates a lot of attention. But I think we also need to realize that, you know, this is cliche that the United States is a country of immigrants. But it is. And we have built this country based on new ideas and more people coming through. And frankly, I think a nice flow of immigrants into the United States actually gives us something that's incredibly important for domestic workers as well, which is a dynamic, evolving, and very thick labor market that allows people to move. You know, sometimes research has shown that sometimes immigrant labor can help, you know, and a Native American, someone who's been here for, was born here or it's been here for a long time, open their own business because now they have people to hire. Or it can help a woman hire childcare so that she can go into the labor market, or a parent of either gender hire childcare so that they can go into the labor market. It's all connected and we support each other. The more people there are coming in, the easier it is for the economy to be dynamic and to continue to grow. And this idea that immigrants are taking from us, that it's a zero-sum game, it's just wrong, and it's based on fears. And it's very frustrating when people try to capitalize on those fears, because the reality is we've had a great economy over the last year. And some of that really has been only because we've had people returning to the United States after COVID, when we had a lot of people leave.
All right, Betsey Stevenson of the University of Michigan, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, an important distinction to make: legal immigration and reforms that system may need, as well as the migration we are seeing on the border. Thank you for joining us this evening. Now, coming up, we'll turn to the fallout from last week's bridge collapse in Baltimore, showing ports across the East Coast trying to absorb some of the overflowing cargo. We'll have that story next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Department of Transportation was able to release $16 million, which obviously is going to be really important, a kind of a down payment, if you will, on getting getting that bridge rebuilt. We're going to have continued conversation with the state of Maryland to get a sense of how much this is going to cost, and we have said we're going to certainly continue to talk to Congress to get some assistance here.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre addressing funding for the collapsed bridge in Baltimore earlier today. That bridge, of course, collapsed a week ago tomorrow. The ports along the East Coast, as a result, have been modifying operations to absorb cargo diverted from Baltimore Harbor. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Naha Katan. Naha, I know you've been following this story closely. We were just hearing from Karine Jean-Pierre on the funding question. There also, though, is the timing question. Are we getting a better sense of just how long it's going to be before the Port of Baltimore reopens?
I wish we were. We're getting a lot of incremental information. They're opening alternative, smaller channels, but mostly for the salvage crew. They're opening now 2 that they've mentioned. But the third and most important one, which would allow commerce to come in and out, there's still, TBA on, when that is going to open.
So a lot of remaining questions in that regard. And of course, whatever timeline it is for opening the port, actually reconstructing the bridge will be significantly longer, we expect. So as I mentioned, in the meantime, a lot of the cargo that would have gone to Baltimore is now going elsewhere, be it New York or south to Norfolk. What exactly are we seeing in terms of the flow of seaborne cargo on the eastern seaboard right now?
Right. So, yes, like you said, it's New York and New Jersey, and it's the Port of Virginia near Norfolk. And each of them is doing their part to accept, the heavy flow. The New York and New Jersey ports really have a lot of workers that were hired during the pandemic, surge. And so they are actually well prepared, well positioned to accept a greater vessel traffic. And but some of their ports are actually opening a little later, opening on Saturdays. And the Port of Virginia also opened an hour earlier today. We're seeing a rail company, a rail line, CSX Corp. They're starting to offer rail service designed to take some of the diverted freight from Baltimore to New York or New York to Baltimore. And the New York and New Jersey ports are also accepting Baltimore truck drivers to come in and take the cargo back up to where it was originally going to go, to Baltimore.
All right, Naha Katan from Bloomberg, thank you so much for joining us. It's important to note that it isn't just the actual seaborne transit and the cargoes we have to think about here, but because the bridge collapsed, it also is an issue for freight and commercial trucks that were using that bridge each and every day and are now having to find different pathways to get to where you're going. So that could mean that those goods take longer to ultimately arrive at their end destination. So much to consider here as we think about the collapse of the bridge and the economic toll it may take. And of course, it already has taken a massive human toll. It's a story we will continue to follow for you here on Bloomberg. Coming up first, though, an election stunner in Turkey. We'll have more on that and what's happening with Israel after talks with the U.S. today. Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute will be joining us next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The idea of moving 1.34 million people under these circumstances, with pressure mounting, particularly with respect to releasing the hostages, and the Israelis persuaded that only by going into Rafah will Hamas be persuaded to cut any sort of deal to release hostages, seems highly unlikely.
That was Aaron David Miller, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Senior Fellow, speaking with me earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio. And joining us now to continue that conversation is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Evelyn, always great to have you on the show. What we were just hearing from Evan David Miller was really a response to what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to say in an address yesterday, talking about how the military plans to move into Rafah to attack the remaining Hamas battalions there after they have moved more than 1 million Palestinian civilians out of the city and given them humanitarian aid. Can Israel credibly pull this off? Should this plan be believed?
I mean, Kaylee, I doubt it. And it looks like our government doubts it because, the Biden administration has been asking the Israelis for consultations on this plan that they have to launch a new round of offensives or an offensive into Rafah. They already have starvation in the north. People are on the brink of starvation and then probably already starving. I know they've reported some deaths of children. And so, the focus should be on getting humanitarian aid in. Our government has said that, on getting the hostages out, on coming to agreement on a ceasefire, which allows both of those things to happen, and then ultimately getting to a peaceful resolution. But I think that the idea that the Israelis could somehow clear 1 million people out of the way of a massive military operation is inconceivable to me.
Well, we know that U.S. Officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, did talk virtually with their Israeli counterparts today. According to the readout of the meeting, they said they share the same objective to get Hamas out of defeated in Rafah, but the U.S. side expressed its concerns with various courses of action. To what degree, Evelyn, do you think the Israelis actually are heeding those concerns or will heed them?
Well, that's the big question. I do think, Kelly, that it is helpful that former President Trump did indicate that he's concerned that Israel is suffering when it comes to the public perception of Israel and public support for Israel. And though he said, get the mission done quickly, which could be interpreted in a lot of different ways, he was warning Israel that, they need to pay attention to the United States and what the perception is here. So it is possible that the Israelis will alter their military plans. I certainly hope that they do. Again, the focus should be on saving innocent lives right now.
Well, of course, there's domestic pressures for the Israelis that factor in here, not just the international pressures coming from the U.S. and other allies. Over the weekend, tens of thousands of people took to the streets calling for a new government in Israel. It was something that Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about yesterday in a televised address. Just take a listen to what he said on the matter.
The calls for elections now, in the middle of the war, just before the victory, will paralyze Israel for at least 6 months, 8 months in my estimation. They will paralyze the negotiations for the release of our hostages. They will bring the war to an end before the completion of its objectives. And the first to bless it will be Hamas, and that says everything.
So I would say, Evelyn, that it doesn't seem he's too supportive of this idea, but still it does speak to pressure that may be on him with the Israeli public. To what extent do you think that changes the way that he moves forward?
Yeah, I think without pressure, he would probably try to drag out the war because he's not interested in holding new elections, because Netanyahu is likely to face a resounding electoral defeat. And that also has implications for him in terms of his legal battle to keep himself out of, being indicted and put in prison. So at the moment, however, this pressure, you mentioned the demonstrations. There have been 2 nights of demonstrations now, hostage families and supporters and Israelis essentially saying, we need to focus on, again, getting the hostages released and moving to elections. I don't think that you can, move to elections immediately. It is true that the military campaign needs to, the war, this phase of the war needs to be brought to an end. It's very difficult. Most democracies don't hold elections in the middle of a war like this. Having said that, this will put pressure on him to demonstrate that he's taking action rather than trying to stretch this out to benefit himself. And I think we will have to keep pressure on Netanyahu to do what's best for the state of Israel, for the people of Israel, and frankly, for the innocent civilians in Gaza. And it's a hard balancing act, but Israel can continue to fight Hamas. It just has to do it in a way that's militarily more precise. And that's what our government's trying to say.
But there also is the question, Evelyn, of if Israel is only actively fighting Hamas or actively fighting in Gaza. Just today, we had reports from Iranian and Syrian state media about an Israeli airstrike on Iran's embassy compound in Syria, which reportedly killed not just one top military commander, but a second general and 5 officers, according to the Associated Press. Should we be concerned about an escalation here?
Well, I think that our government, we've heard it from the National Security Advisor, from Jake Sullivan and others, there's definitely been a fear of this war widening. And so these strikes do raise that fear or kind of make one think about the danger that the war will expand. However, such strikes in Syria have been normal in the sense that Israel has taken this kind of military action for years now. So I don't think that this strike alone in Syria will be something that broadens the war. The other thing is we have seen that when we came close to having the war expand to include the Iranian state itself, that Iran warned its proxies not to go too far, because Iran itself does not want to get involved in a direct war right now with Israel. I think Iran feels that the best option for them is to have their proxies continue to fight Israel.
Well, when we think about the wider picture of the Middle East, Evelyn, we also got news over the weekend out of Turkey, where the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ruling party was dealt a number of blows in municipal elections. Should we be concerned about what's happening in Turkey and how it changes the landscape here, or is it just kind of an idiosyncratic, unique to the domestic issues Erdogan is facing?
Well, Turkey is a really interesting country because, you mentioned it in the context of the Middle East, but it really straddles the Middle East and Europe, right? And under Erdogan, frankly, it's taken more of a Middle Eastern or pro-Middle Eastern turn. Erdogan's been really active on the issue of the Palestinian people and their rights. He's made his Islamist identity, and his Islamist party has been very active in a way that is different from the approach that Turkey has taken in the past when the military was more dominant, a more secular approach. So Erdogan is straddling, as I said, Middle East and Europe. I think the kind of more pro-Western, more democratic forces show that they still have a lot of strength in Turkey. And this does have implications beyond Turkey, because I think all of the kind of strong men around the world and in Europe in particular, and we can add Viktor Orban to this this discussion, they take strength from one another. And when they see, like on the converse, that one of them is suffering from domestic opposition or that they are facing domestic opposition, they also take note of that, and they tend to kind of become less bold. And in Hungary also, Viktor Orban is now being challenged by the opposition with real demonstrations on the street because of a scandal there. So I do think it has real implications beyond Turkey.
Well, and you make an excellent point about how this also factors into the European equation as well. And we know there is an ongoing war on that continent too, Evelyn. On the subject of Ukraine, we did hear from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, in an interview yesterday talking about a path forward for aid in the House. He has, though, some what he calls new innovations, this potentially being a loan rather than outright aid that is given, potentially using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's war effort. Are these ideas that maybe sound good in principle but are hard to make reality, or could they work?
I think they could work. And frankly, from the perspective of the Ukrainians and all of us who really want Ukraine to persevere, because it's important for European security, for U.S. security, for the way that we counter China in Asia. So I'm bringing the whole world in here, Kaylee. We need to make sure that Ukraine can remain undefeated. In fact, that Ukraine becomes successful. I have a piece in The Hill that ran yesterday. It's still up on the website. It's basically arguing that there are a lot of factors that indicate that Ukraine is not only winning, but will come out victorious in the end, provided we give them this assistance. The frozen assets are $330 billion. If Ukraine could get that, it will for sure outlast Russia in this war and likely prevail. And also it'll provide a nice glide path for them into European Union membership, because they will no longer be a poor state trying to join the Union.
All right, a trip around the world with Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Balance of Power. And coming up next on the program, we'll have more on Speaker Johnson's proposal for potentially getting a House vote on Ukraine aid when they return from recess. We'll play it to our political panel next. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
some things need to be bipartisan. Now, we're talking about the supplemental that everybody's heard so much about. There's a lot of things that we should do that are make more sense and that I think we'll have consensus around. We're putting that product together and we'll be moving it right after the district work period.
That was House Speaker Mike Johnson on Fox News yesterday. Joining us now for more is Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, and Lester Munson, international BGR government affairs principal. Thank you both so much for participating in our political panel this evening. Lester, as we think about some of the ideas that the speaker has outlined and what he thinks this Ukraine aid should look like, potentially putting more of it in the form of a loan, potentially using frozen Russian assets to pay for Ukraine's war effort, are these ideas likely to be the ones that can make it across the finish line, and can they work if they do?
Well, I think the loan idea has an interesting heritage. Of course, the U.S. had Lend-Lease before World War II, or before the U.S. entry into World War II with the British and the French. By the way, the British only paid that off like 20 years ago. So I think the precedent for doing a loan for Ukraine makes some sense. It's not optimal, but it makes some sense that if it gives people political cover, I think that's fine. On the frozen Russian assets, I think we're underestimating how difficult it'll be legally to get access to those things in the immediate term. In the long run, it's a great idea, and go get them and give it to Ukraine. That makes sense. But it's not going to help Ukraine probably in the next few months.
And of course, it's not entirely in the U.S.'s control. A lot of those assets are being cared for by Europe, if you will, and you'd have to get that buy-in. But on the subject of buy-in, Jeannie, it's not just Europeans that you might have to talk to, but Democrats as well. Are they likely to go along with just anything that Speaker Johnson puts on the floor if it gets funding to Ukraine in some form?
Yeah, I think they're going to work with him. I don't think they're going to go with just anything. We're hearing from the administration that the idea of using the Russian assets is something that they would like to save as a last resort for all of the reasons that Lester just laid out. The issue of really the first idea of the loan is one that is very complicated, one that Democrats are cold to, Ukrainian leadership is cold to, bond investors are cold to. So could it happen? Yes. But I think, what's troubling a bit about all of this is the best and fastest way to get the most needed money to Ukraine is to push forward with the $95 billion that the Senate passed. I mean, Congress trying to find all these ways to end run around what they should be doing as the people who control the purse, which is putting forward the funding and passing the Senate bill. And so, they may use one of these other options, but they're not optimal in any fashion.
Well, Jeannie, we certainly heard echoes of what you're saying from the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, who spoke with reporters earlier today. Here she is.
We've been very clear. We believe that the speaker were to put the national security supplemental on the floor, obviously includes Ukraine, humanitarian aid, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific. We believe, and it is fact, that it would get majority bipartisan support on the floor in the House.
So, Lester, it seems like it might be unlikely that the actual Senate-passed bill is what reaches the House floor. But even if it's something of Mike Johnson's own concoction, whatever it is, if it includes Ukraine aid, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, has signaled that will be the triggering event of the motion to vacate she filed but has not yet acted on. Do you think she's bluffing, or do you think she'll really do that if they return from recess and Mike Johnson puts something on the floor?
I don't know yet. She got pretty bad reviews from her colleagues for filing that motion. Can she find 2 or 3 other Republican House members to go along with her? I'm not sure she can. And I think if she can't find them, and she's going to need at least 2 of them, I think, to be successful here by my math, I don't think she'll do it. So if you see that support for her grow maybe a little bit, maybe it's possible. But Mike Johnson is not Kevin McCarthy. He doesn't have the baggage that McCarthy did. He's a fresh face. Almost all of the Republican conference really likes him, and they don't want to go through this unnecessary drama again.
Well, even Marjorie Taylor Greene, after filing the motion, said, I think he's a good guy. It doesn't seem like it's as personal, even if she does move forward with this. But Jeannie, as Lester is talking about the idea, she only needs to find 2 Republicans to go along. In that same vein, you only need to find 2 Democrats not to do it to prevent this, right? And is that more likely to happen this time around than what happened with Kevin McCarthy when all of them united did not not protect his speakership.
Yeah, I think we are hearing from moderate Democrats that they, too, don't want to go through this again. It was, interesting to hear yesterday in the interview, Mike Johnson talking about the fact that he's texting and communicating with Marjorie Taylor Greene, describing her as a friend. To Lester's point, he has a very different relationship with some of these members. But I have to say, hearing Matt Gaetz give advice to Mike Johnson about how to avoid the motion to vacate must make Kevin McCarthy's hair go on fire. This is where we are at this point. Speaker Johnson knows every step of this is going to be difficult, but you look at the Pew poll, 3/4 of Americans think aid for Ukraine is in the national interest. So I think one way or another, they will get this done. And Speaker Johnson's just going to try to do it in a way that doesn't cost him his job.
All right, Jeannie and Lester are going to be sticking with us because coming up, we have to talk about President Biden gaining some ground in battleground states, but Donald Trump is making a few stops to them this week. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Donald Trump's net worth has dropped by almost $1 billion as his social media business that just went public last week disclosed a loss of more than $58 million in 2023. The stock taking a bit of a beating today as a result. Back with us now, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, and Lester Munson, international BGR government affairs principal. So, Lester, obviously we here at Bloomberg are very interested in this as a stock story, but some people are saying this is a stock that is actually a proxy for the likelihood of Trump winning re-election. Obviously, the effect on his net worth could help him as he fights a multi-front legal battle and is struggling a bit in the fundraising department. How should we be thinking about the Trump candidacy and the Trump money and how they are intertwined?
Well, I do think it makes some sense to, as they say, follow the money. Why does he do these crazy things like the tweet about President Biden on the truck all tied up? It's to be provocative. It's to be controversial. It's to drive eyeballs and clicks. That helps his new company drive up the value. That makes him more money. I think it's very possible that he's in this whole thing for the money.
Jeannie, your thought?
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe his Bible sales could make up for that loss, but I sort of doubt it. This is, mind-numbing because the reality is, once again, what is legal in campaign finance in our system is often what is most frustrating for those of us who care about democracy. And of course, everything he is doing by way of Truth Social is legal, but it is mind-numbing to think that people can give to the presidential candidate on the Republican side in this way, despite the fact that the company lost so much money. So, this is something that we are going to be watching. We've never seen anything like this, but that's a mantra we keep saying this entire election year. A president making this kind of money on the stock market and then losing this kind of money on the stock market while they're facing trials and running for office.
Well, and on the subject of running, Jeannie, he's going to be in Wisconsin and Michigan this week, visiting some of those swing states where, at least in most recent polling by us here at Bloomberg together with Morning Consult, Joe Biden is starting to gain some ground. Can this keep going, or Donald Trump making visits makes it harder for Biden to continue to gain traction?
I think this is going to be neck and neck throughout, but it was fascinating to see the Bloomberg poll that, showed that Biden was making inroads. And I have to say, my read on this is that the more Donald Trump is in the news, the more moderate independent voters get turned off. And the more Biden is in the news, the more moderate and independent voters get turned off from him. And so, I think the 77 or so truths that he did on Sunday, it may help him intimidate witnesses and judges and all kinds of things, but it doesn't help where he needs to win in these battleground states. And that's something he's going to contend with, his style impacting his ability to win in the general, which is what happened to him, quite frankly, in 2020.
Lester, just quickly, we have like 30 seconds left. You brought up the video that he reposted with the image of Biden hogtied in the back of a pickup truck. We all know about the bloodbath comment from a few weeks ago. Are we seeing overreaction to these things, or is this a pattern that deserves to be recognized?
I think it is a pattern. It's outrageous behavior. It's offensive on its face. It shouldn't be done. It's inappropriate. And I think he's doing it to drive clicks and make himself some money and stay in the news as a notorious person.
All right. And on that note, we will leave it. Lester Munson and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you both so much for joining this evening. And of course, for more Washington coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and see us back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.